Imagine sinking your teeth into meat that has been buried in a freezing swamp for 6 months, meat that was originally so poisonous it could kill you within hours, meat that now smells like ammonia strong enough to burn your nostrils. This is not some modern survival show stunt designed for shock value and television ratings. This was breakfast for Viking warriors preparing to row across the North Atlantic Ocean for weeks without seeing land. The Vikings, those legendary Norse seafarers who terrorized Europe from the 8th to 11th centuries, did not conquer half the known world because of their swords or their ships or even their legendary courage in battle. They conquered it because they solved a problem that had destroyed every other civilization that tried to expand across vast distances. How do you feed an army for months when you have no refrigeration, no industrial supply chains, and worst of all, no access to salt? We have been lied to about Vikings and salt for generations by historians who did not bother to check the economics. You have seen the images in textbooks and movies, right? Vikings packing barrels full of salt to preserve their food like every other medieval society. But here's the truth that will change everything you thought you knew about Norse civilization. In Scandinavia, during the Viking Age, salt was not just expensive, it was valued as highly as silver itself, a luxury item that only the wealthiest jarls and kings could afford in any quantity. Salt had to be extracted by evaporating massive quantities of seawater, a process so labor-intensive and time-consuming that it made salt worth more per pound than many metals. An average Viking farmer or warrior could not afford to salt enough meat to last through winter, let alone enough to feed a crew of 50 men rowing to England or Iceland or Greenland for months. So, what did they do instead when faced with tons of fresh fish and meat that would rot within days in summer heat? They became masters of what we would today call food science, developing 6 revolutionary preservation methods that used the only resources they had in abundance. Icy winds that howled down from the Arctic. Sour dairy products produced in vast quantities by their cattle. Thick, acrid smoke from burning wood that was everywhere. Frozen ground that never thawed even in summer. And perhaps most shocking of all, the chemistry of fermentation taken to extremes that would make modern food safety inspectors faint with horror. These technologies were not just clever survival tricks passed down through families. They were industrial-scale systems that allowed Vikings to store food for years, not weeks. Archaeological evidence shows massive fish drying operations that processed thousands of tons annually. We're talking about facilities that would dwarf many modern food processing plants in terms of the sheer volume they handled. The Vikings did not just survive on these methods, they built an empire on them. Every longship that sailed from Norway to raid the coast of England carried tons of food preserved through techniques we are about to reveal. Every settlement in Iceland and Greenland that survived the brutal winters did so because of these preservation secrets. This was not primitive survival. This was advanced biochemistry that worked so well that Scandinavians still use these exact methods today to create delicacies that sell for premium prices in the finest restaurants of Europe. But before we dive into the science and the shocking details of how Vikings made poisonous shark meat edible, we need to understand why salt was useless to them in the first place. Most people assume Vikings salted their fish just like everyone else in medieval Europe, but this assumption ignores basic economics and geography. The Baltic Sea, where many Vikings lived, has low salinity compared to oceans, making salt extraction even more difficult. Importing salt from southern Europe, where it was produced more easily, meant paying prices that would bankrupt most communities. A barrel of salt might cost as much as a good sword, and you would need dozens of barrels to preserve enough food for winter. The Vikings were nothing if not practical and resourceful people who refused to let economics limit their ambitions. If salt was too expensive, they would find alternatives. And the alternatives they developed were not just replacements, they were in many ways superior to salting because they added flavor, improved nutrition, and lasted even longer than salt-preserved food. The 6 methods we are about to explore represent one of the great forgotten technological achievements of the medieval world. Wind drying that turned fish into virtually indestructible stockfish. acid preservation using way that created an anaerobic environment, cold smoking that infused food with antimicrobial compounds, underground storage in permafrost and peat bogs that worked better than any cellar, extreme fermentation that could detoxify poisonous fish, and dairy fermentation that produced foods that could last months. Each method complemented the others in a waste-free system where nothing was discarded and everything had a purpose. Are you ready to discover how Vikings built what were essentially edible skyscrapers out of fish using nothing but wind and patience? The centerpiece of Viking food preservation was a technology so massive in scale that it still dominates the economy of northern Norway today over 1,000 years later. We are talking about enormous wooden frames that looked like giant racks stretching for hundreds of meters along rocky coastlines where the wind never stopped blowing. These were not simple structures thrown together from spare wood. They were carefully engineered facilities positioned in locations where cold Arctic winds would blow constantly across them, locations that had been identified through generations of trial and error. The best hagel were built on the windswept shores of fjords in northern Norway, particularly in the Lofoten Islands, where geographic conditions created perfect drying weather for months on end. Imagine walking along a Viking settlement in winter and seeing thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of fish carcasses hanging from these massive wooden cathedrals of preservation, swaying in the freezing wind like some bizarre forest of marine life. The scale was industrial, not domestic. Archaeological evidence and medieval records describe operations that processed the entire winter catch of cod from the Lofoten fishery, which could mean hundreds of thousands of fish being dried simultaneously in a single location. This was food production at a level that could feed armies and supply trade networks spanning from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The fish most commonly dried this way was cod, particularly the Arctic cod that migrated to northern Norway waters every winter in massive schools. These fish were caught during the coldest months from January through March, when air temperatures hovered near 0 degrees Celsius, which was absolutely critical for the process to work. The fish would be gutted immediately after catching to remove the organs that would cause rapid spoilage, then tied in pairs by their tails using simple knots that had been perfected over centuries. These pairs would be thrown over the wooden poles of the hagel, hanging vertically with their heads down so that any remaining fluids would drip out. The process that followed was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its efficiency. For the next 2 to 3 months, these fish hung in the open air as cold, dry Arctic winds slowly stripped away moisture. The temperature was crucial. It needed to stay just above freezing to prevent the fish from freezing solid, but below the temperature where bacteria could thrive and cause rot. This narrow temperature window between 0 and 5 degrees Celsius created the perfect environment for slow dehydration without decomposition. The constant movement of air was equally important because stagnant air would allow moisture to linger and mold to develop. The combination of wind, cold, and time worked like a natural freeze dryer, pulling water molecules out of the fish tissue while preserving the protein and nutrients inside. Over those months, the fish would lose up to 80% of their original weight as water evaporated, transforming them into something that bore little resemblance to fresh fish. The final product, known as stockfish or TR fisk in Norwegian, was as hard as a piece of wood, which is literally what the name means in English. You could bang stockfish against a rock and it would sound like hitting timber. This rock-hard fish could be stored for years, not months or weeks, but actual years without spoiling even in relatively warm conditions. It was completely immune to bacterial growth because bacteria need moisture to survive and stockfish contained almost none. The preservation was so complete that stockfish has been found in archaeological sites, still perfectly edible after being buried for centuries. For Viking warriors preparing for long voyages, stockfish was the perfect food. It was incredibly lightweight compared to fresh fish, making it ideal for ships where every pound mattered. It was compact enough to be stacked in ship holds without taking up excessive space. It required no special storage conditions, no barrels, no salt, no cooling. You could literally just pile it in a corner of the ship and forget about it until you needed to eat. And despite being hard as wood, stockfish was incredibly nutritious, containing concentrated protein and essential nutrients that could sustain men doing the brutal physical work of rowing Viking longships for hours each day. The energy density was remarkable. 1 kilogram of stockfish provided roughly the same protein as 5 kilograms of fresh fish, meaning Vikings could carry 5 times as much food in the same space. But how did you actually eat something that could be used as a club in a fight? The preparation method before consumption was crucial and required patience and water. Stockfish had to be beaten repeatedly with hammers or rocks to break down the tough fibers and make it softer, a process that would take considerable time and effort. Then it needed to be soaked in fresh water for 24 to 48 hours to rehydrate the tissue and restore some of its original texture. After this soaking, the stockfish would become soft enough to tear apart and eat, though it would never quite regain the texture of fresh fish. Vikings typically boiled rehydrated stockfish in water to make a protein-rich soup or stew, often adding whatever vegetables or grains were available to create a complete meal. The economic impact of stockfish production cannot be overstated when examining Viking expansion and trade networks. This was not just food for personal consumption. It was one of medieval Scandinavia's most valuable export commodities. Viking merchants traded stockfish throughout Europe, exchanging it for grain from England, timber from the Baltic, silver from the Middle East, and luxury goods from Byzantium. The stockfish trade created wealth that funded ship construction, equipped armies, and established Norse settlements across the North Atlantic. Cities in northern Norway grew rich from the stockfish trade, and the economic patterns established during the Viking Age continued for centuries afterward. Even today, Norway exports thousands of tons of stockfish annually, primarily to Italy and Portugal, where it remains a traditional ingredient in dishes like Italian bacalhau or Portuguese bacalhau. The method has changed remarkably little since the Viking Age, because it simply works too well to improve upon. But wind-dried fish had limitations that Vikings quickly discovered through bitter experience. The method only worked effectively in cold, dry climates during specific seasons. If you tried to air-dry fish in summer or in humid conditions, it would rot before it dried. If temperatures rose above 10 degrees Celsius, bacterial growth would outpace dehydration, and the fish would spoil. This meant stockfish production was limited to winter months in northern regions, which created a problem for preserving food caught or hunted during other seasons. What did Vikings do with the massive quantities of meat from livestock slaughtered in autumn or fish caught in warmer months when air drying would fail? This is where the second method comes in, and it is going to shock you because it involves a waste product that you would pour down the drain without a second thought. The Vikings had stumbled onto one of the most important discoveries in food preservation history, and it came from their cows. Scandinavians during the Viking Age were accomplished dairy farmers who raised cattle for milk production on a scale that would surprise most people who think of Vikings only as warriors and raiders. These cows produced massive quantities of milk that was processed into various products, including butter, cheese, and a thick fermented dairy product called skyr that remains popular in Iceland today. The process of making cheese and skyr left behind an enormous amount of liquid waste, the watery byproduct known as whey. Most cultures throughout history simply discarded whey as useless, but Vikings noticed something fascinating about this supposedly worthless liquid. It was incredibly sour due to the presence of lactic acid bacteria that had fermented the milk, and this sourness created an environment where food seemed to resist spoilage. The lactic acid bacteria, in whey primarily Lactobacillus species, created an acidic environment with a pH low enough to inhibit the growth of pathogenic bacteria that cause food poisoning and spoilage. This was the same principle behind other fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi, but Vikings had discovered it independently through observation rather than scientific understanding. The acid essentially pickled food, preserving it through chemistry rather than through drying or salting. The process Vikings developed for whey preservation was straightforward but required careful attention to detail. Meat or fish would be cut into manageable pieces, sometimes parboiled first to kill surface bacteria and partially cook the proteins. These pieces would then be packed tightly into wooden barrels, with Vikings using whatever barrels they had available from wine or ale production. Once packed, the barrels would be filled completely with whey, ensuring that every piece of meat or fish was fully submerged in the acidic liquid with no air gaps. This was critical because the preservation worked through anaerobic conditions, meaning the absence of oxygen. Bacteria that cause food to rot require oxygen to thrive, and by creating an oxygen-free environment filled with acid, Vikings created conditions where spoilage bacteria simply could not survive. The barrels would then be sealed as tightly as possible using wooden lids that were secured with iron hoops and sometimes sealed with wax or tar to ensure complete airtightness. These sealed barrels would be stored in the coolest place available, either in underground cellars that maintained temperatures near freezing year-round, or sometimes buried in the ground itself to keep them cold. In this acidic, oxygen-free environment at low temperatures, meat and fish could be preserved for months without spoiling. The meat would take on a characteristic sour taste from the lactic acid, similar to pickled foods we eat today, and the texture would become very tender because the acid broke down tough connective tissue and muscle fibers. This tenderizing effect was particularly valuable for Vikings, who often had to deal with tough, stringy meat from old animals or wild game that would normally be difficult to chew. The acid essentially pre-digested the meat, making even the toughest cuts palatable and easier to eat. This method was known as starvation in Old Norse, and it was practiced throughout Scandinavia, but became especially important in Iceland, where it developed into a major part of the traditional cuisine that continues today. Icelanders preserved almost everything through whey fermentation because their isolation made other preservation methods difficult. Lamb, fish, seal, meat, even certain vegetables went into the acidic baths. The starvation process represented perfect sustainability because it used a waste product from one food production process, cheesemaking, to preserve completely different food. Nothing was wasted in the Viking system. The whey that would have been discarded became the key to storing protein through seasons when fresh meat was unavailable. It was a closed-loop system that would make modern sustainability experts envious. The science behind this preservation method is fascinating when examined through modern microbiology. Lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid as a byproduct of fermenting lactose, the sugar in milk. This acid lowers the pH of the whey to around 3.5 to 4.0, which is acidic enough to create an environment hostile to most pathogenic bacteria, including dangerous species like Clostridium botulinum that causes botulism and Salmonella that causes food poisoning. The acid also helps preserve vitamins and nutrients that might otherwise be lost through other preservation methods. Vikings did not understand the microbiology, but they understood through experience that whey-preserved food stayed safe to eat for months and tasted good, which was all that mattered for their purposes. But whey preservation had limitations that Vikings needed to work around. It only worked well in cool conditions, because warm temperatures could allow acid-resistant bacteria to grow and spoil the food, despite the acidic environment. It also required watertight barrels that were increasingly difficult to produce and transport as Vikings ventured further from their woodland sources of oak and pine. And while the sour flavor was acceptable to Viking palates accustomed to fermented foods, it was not ideal for every type of food or every situation. So what did Vikings do when they needed to preserve food but could not use wind drying because of humidity and could not use whey because they lacked barrels or wanted different flavors? The answer lies in humanity's oldest preservation method, taken to levels of sophistication that would not be matched until the Industrial Revolution. Fire had been used to preserve food since prehistoric times, but Vikings turned smoking from a simple technique into an industrial art with specialized facilities and carefully controlled processes. Smoking worked through a combination of three mechanisms that Vikings understood intuitively, even if they could not explain the chemistry. First, the heat from smoke helped drive moisture out of food, similar to air drying but faster. Second, The smoke deposited chemical compounds on the surface of the food that had antimicrobial properties, killing bacteria and preventing new bacteria from colonizing the food. Third, certain compounds in smoke created a protective coating that sealed the food surface and prevented oxygen from reaching the interior, slowing down oxidation and rancidity. Vikings practiced two distinct types of smoking that served different purposes and produced very different results. Hot smoking was essentially cooking with smoke, where food was placed close to a fire and exposed to temperatures high enough to cook the meat or fish thoroughly while infusing it with smoke flavor. Hot smoked food was delicious and ready to eat immediately, but it did not have a long shelf life because the cooking process did not remove enough moisture to prevent eventual spoilage. Hot smoked foods needed to be consumed within a few days unless they were subsequently dried or stored in very cold conditions. This method was used more for immediate consumption and flavor than for long-term preservation. Cold smoking was where Viking preservation expertise truly shone. This was a slow, methodical process that could take days or even weeks, depending on the size and type of food being preserved. The key difference was temperature. Cold smoking was done at temperatures between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, which was warm enough to generate smoke, but not hot enough to actually cook the meat or fish. The food would be placed in a specially constructed smokehouse, which could range from a simple shed to an elaborate structure with multiple levels and careful ventilation control. The fire that produced the smoke was located away from the food, either in a separate chamber connected by a tunnel or in a pit outside the smokehouse with smoke channeled through underground passages. This separation allowed the smoke to cool down before reaching the food, which was critical for true cold smoking. The fire itself was carefully tended to produce thick, cool smoke rather than flames. Vikings would use wood that was slightly damp, or they would smother the fire with sawdust to keep it smoldering rather than burning hot. The process required constant attention because if the fire got too hot, it would cook the food and ruin the preservation. If the fire went out, the smoking process would be interrupted and the food could begin to spoil before enough antimicrobial compounds had been deposited. Someone needed to maintain the smoke day and night for the duration of the smoking period, which could extend for weeks for large pieces of meat. During this extended smoking period, multiple things happened to the food at a chemical level that Vikings could observe but not fully understand. The smoke, which is actually a complex mixture of gases, water vapor, and tiny particles suspended in air, contained hundreds of different chemical compounds. The most important for preservation were phenols and aldehydes, organic compounds that are produced when wood burns at relatively low temperatures. These compounds had powerful antimicrobial properties that killed bacteria on contact and prevented new bacterial growth. They also had antioxidant properties that slowed down the chemical reactions that cause fats to become rancid and meat to develop off flavors. As smoke continuously washed over the hanging meat or fish hour after hour, day after day, these compounds gradually penetrated into the tissue and accumulated on the surface. The surface of properly smoked food would develop a distinctive pellicle, a thin, tough, slightly shiny coating that was partially dried tissue and partially a layer of deposited smoke compound. This pellicle acted as a protective seal that prevented oxygen and moisture from entering the food while allowing any remaining internal moisture to slowly escape. The color of the food would gradually change from its natural shade to golden brown and eventually to a deep mahogany color as smoke compounds accumulated. This color change was not just cosmetic, it was a visual indication of how thoroughly the food had been preserved. The deeper the color, the more smoke compounds had penetrated the tissue, and the longer the food would last in storage. The choice of wood used for smoking was critically important because different woods produced smoke with different flavors and different concentrations of preservative compounds. Vikings preferred certain woods that grew abundantly in Scandinavia and that they had learned through experience produced the best results. Alder was perhaps the most commonly used wood because it burned slowly and produced thick, cool smoke with a relatively mild flavor that did not overpower the taste of fish. Juniper was prized for its distinctive aromatic smoke that not only preserved food, but gave it a unique piney flavor that was considered a delicacy. Beech was used for meats because it produced a subtly sweet smoke that complemented pork and beef. Oak was occasionally used despite being more valuable as construction lumber because its smoke had excellent preservative qualities. Different regions and different families developed their own preferences and secret techniques passed down through generations. The smokehouse itself was usually a relatively simple structure from the outside but carefully designed internally for optimal smoke circulation. The most basic smokehouse might be nothing more than a pit dug in the ground and covered with branches to trap the smoke with food hanging from sticks suspended across the opening. More sophisticated smokehouses were wooden sheds built specifically for the purpose, with no windows to prevent smoke from escaping and with racks or poles at multiple heights for hanging food. The critical design element was ensuring that smoke could circulate around all the food evenly, while not escaping too quickly or allowing outside air to enter and dilute the smoke. Some Viking smokehouses had vents that could be opened or closed to control airflow and smoke density, showing a sophisticated understanding of how smoke moved through enclosed spaces. The results of proper cold smoking were remarkable in terms of preservation duration. Smoked fish like salmon or herring could last for months stored in a cool, dry place. Smoked meats, like pork or venison, could last even longer, particularly if they were also dried after smoking to remove additional moisture. The combination of smoking and drying created food that was virtually indestructible and could survive years in storage if kept away from moisture and pests. For Vikings embarking on ocean voyages where fresh food was impossible, smoked fish and meat were essential provisions that provided protein and fat in a form that would not spoil even after weeks at sea. Unlike stockfish, which required extensive preparation before eating, smoked food could be consumed directly without rehydration, though it was often boiled in soups and stews to soften it and stretch the rations. The trade value of smoked fish was considerable, though not quite as high as stockfish, and Viking merchants exported smoked herring and salmon throughout medieval Europe. But smoking had its own limitations that Vikings had to work around. It required a constant supply of wood in a region where forests were precious and often distant from coastal settlements. It required structures and constant attention that made it labor-intensive compared to simply hanging fish in the wind. And most critically, it did not work well for certain fatty foods that were valuable to Viking diets. Fish like cod could be smoked successfully, but the very fatty fish like mackerel did not smoke well, because the high fat content prevented proper smoke penetration, and the fats could become rancid despite the antimicrobial compounds. Butter, which was one of the most calorie-dense and valuable foods in the Viking diet, could not be preserved through smoking at all. So what did Vikings do with butter and other fatty foods that could not be dried, pickled in whey, or smoked? The answer involves technology so strange that when modern archaeologists first discovered the evidence, they thought it was accidental food loss rather than deliberate preservation. Vikings buried their most valuable foods underground, and the results have survived for over 1,000 years in perfect condition. The Viking use of underground storage was based on two fundamental principles that they understood through observation, even if they could not explain the science. First, cold preserves food by slowing down the chemical reactions and biological processes that cause spoilage. Second, the absence of oxygen prevents the growth of aerobic bacteria that cause most food spoilage. By combining these two principles through underground burial, Vikings created what were essentially natural cold storage facilities that worked as well as modern refrigeration for many purposes. In the northernmost regions of Scandinavia and in the Viking settlements of Iceland and Greenland, the ground remained permanently frozen at depths below 1 or 2 meters, a condition known as permafrost. This permanent frost created a natural freezer that maintained temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of surface conditions. Vikings in these regions would dig deep pits or cellars that extended down into the permafrost layer, creating storage spaces where the temperature never rose above freezing. Meat and fish stored in these underground freezers would remain frozen solid for months or even years, preserved exactly as if they had been placed in a modern electric freezer. The effort required to dig these cellars through frozen ground was immense, often taking weeks of hard labor with primitive tools to excavate just a few cubic meters of storage space. But once constructed, these permafrost cellars were permanent installations that could be used year after year for generations, becoming valuable assets that added to the worth of a farmstead or settlement. Archaeological excavations have found the remains of these storage cellars throughout Viking settlements in northern regions, often still containing the remnants of the food that was stored there over 1,000 years ago. The preservation was so effective that archaeologists have recovered recognizable meat and fish from these cellars, though obviously not in edible condition after a millennium. But the truly bizarre method of underground preservation that Vikings developed was not in permafrost, but in peat bogs, and this technique has produced some of the most remarkable archaeological finds of the Viking Age. Peat bogs, which are wetlands where dead plant material accumulates faster than it can decompose, creating thick layers of partially decayed vegetation, have unique chemical properties that Vikings learned to exploit for food storage. The sphagnum moss that dominates most peat bogs releases organic acids as it decays, creating an environment that is extremely acidic with a pH often below 4. This acidity is similar to the whey preservation method we discussed earlier, but even more extreme. Combined with the cold temperatures deep in the bog, the lack of oxygen, because the bog water contains very little dissolved oxygen, and the presence of natural antimicrobial compounds in the peat itself, these bogs created conditions where bacteria simply could not function. Vikings, like other northern European peoples, discovered that they could preserve butter for years by burying it in peat bogs. The process was simple, but required careful preparation. Butter would be packed tightly into wooden barrels or sometimes into containers made from bark, sealed as tightly as possible to prevent bog water from contaminating the contents. These containers would then be carried to a nearby bog and lowered carefully into the peat, usually to a depth of 1 to 2 meters, where the peat was densest and the temperature most stable. The locations were often marked so the butter could be retrieved when needed, though sometimes the markers were lost or destroyed, and the butter remained buried. The preservation was so effective that butter could remain in these bog conditions, not just for months or years, but for decades or even centuries without spoiling in a conventional sense. The acidity and lack of oxygen prevented bacterial decay, while the cool temperature prevented the fats from becoming rancid through chemical oxidation. The butter would change in texture, becoming harder and wax-like, and it would take on a distinctive flavor from the peat itself, but it remained fundamentally edible. Modern archaeologists and peat cutters have discovered hundreds of these bog butter deposits throughout Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, some of them containing butter that is over 1,000 years old, but still recognizably butter rather than some unidentifiable sludge. The age of these deposits can be determined through radiocarbon dating, and chemical analysis confirms that the fats have been preserved in remarkably good condition. Some researchers have even tasted these ancient butters, reporting that while the flavor is strange and certainly not pleasant by modern standards, particularly because of the strong peat flavor that has permeated the fat, the butter is still fundamentally butter, rather than having decomposed into something else. The Vikings probably used this bog preservation not just for butter, but for other fatty foods and possibly for meat as well, though the evidence for meat preservation in bogs is less clear than the evidence for butter. The advantage of bog preservation was that it required no equipment beyond a container and no maintenance once the food was buried. The disadvantages were that you needed a suitable peat bog nearby, which not all Viking settlements had access to, and that the food took on strong flavors from the peat that not everyone found palatable. But for long-term strategic reserves of high-calorie fat bog butter was unmatched by any other preservation method available to Vikings. This method represents Viking preservation technology, at its most extreme, using the earth itself as a preservative medium. But we have saved the most shocking preservation method for now, a technique so extreme that it requires burying poisonous fish in gravel for months and produces a smell so powerful that tourists today are challenged to eat even small pieces without gagging. We are talking about the fermentation of Greenland shark into the Icelandic specialty known as H. Karl, and this method reveals just how far Vikings were willing to go to waste no potential food source. The Greenland shark, which can grow over 6 meters long and weigh over a ton, was abundant in the waters around Iceland and Greenland and represented an enormous amount of potential protein for Viking settlers who lived in regions where food was scarce and winters were brutal. But there was one massive problem that made this shark initially seem like unusable food despite its size. The flesh of a freshly killed Greenland shark is highly poisonous to humans, because it contains extremely high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide chemicals that the shark uses to maintain osmotic balance in its body, because it lacks a urinary system. If you ate fresh Greenland shark meat, these chemicals would cause severe illness, including symptoms similar to extreme drunkenness, potentially leading to death in large doses. The levels of these toxins are so high that even most scavengers will not eat fresh Greenland shark, and dogs fed the meat can become so intoxicated they cannot stand. For most cultures, this would mean accepting that Greenland sharks, despite being huge and relatively easy to catch, were simply not edible and should be left alone. But Vikings in Iceland, facing starvation during harsh winters, were not willing to waste thousands of pounds of potential protein just because it was poisonous in its fresh state. They experimented with preservation methods until they discovered a process that could detoxify the meat through a combination of fermentation and extended drying that broke down the toxic compounds into harmless byproduct. The traditional H. Karl preparation method developed by Vikings and still used in Iceland today is a months-long process that requires specific conditions and considerable patience. First, the shark carcass would be gutted and the head removed. Then the body would be cut into large pieces weighing perhaps 20 to 50 kilograms each. These pieces, which still contained the toxic urea and trimethylamine oxide, would be placed in shallow pits dug into gravel or coarse sand near the ocean shore, where drainage was good. The gravel was important because it allowed fluids to drain away rather than pooling around the meat. The pieces of shark would be arranged in the pit with space between them and then covered with more gravel and sand. Heavy stones, often weighing several hundred kilograms total, would be placed on top to press down on the meat and squeeze out the toxic fluids. Over the next 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the temperature and size of the pieces, the shark meat would undergo a fermentation process driven by the bacteria naturally present in the meat and in the gravel. The pressure from the stones forced toxic fluids out of the tissue, and these fluids would drain away through the porous gravel rather than remaining in contact with the meat. At the same time, bacterial action began breaking down the urea and trimethylamine oxide into other compounds. This was not a controlled fermentation like cheese or whey preservation. It was essentially allowing the meat to begin decomposing under controlled conditions where the toxic components would break down faster than the meat itself rotted. The process required careful monitoring because if the conditions were wrong, the meat could rot completely and become truly inedible rather than just fermented. After this underground fermentation period, the meat would be removed from the pits and the real transformation would begin. The fermented shark pieces would be hung on wooden racks similar to the A-gel used for drying stockfish, but these racks were usually under cover or in special drying sheds to protect the meat from direct rain while still allowing air circulation. Here, the meat would hang for several more months, typically 3 to 5 months, slowly drying in the cold Icelandic air. During this extended drying period, additional chemical changes occurred that further broke down any remaining toxins while the meat lost moisture and became firm. The smell that developed during this process is legendary and difficult to describe adequately to someone who has never encountered it. The ammonia produced by the breakdown of urea gives the fermenting shark a smell so powerful that it can be detected from considerable distances, a sharp, acrid nose-burning smell that is far stronger than the ammonia smell of cleaning products. First-time visitors to Iceland who attempt to eat H. Carl often report that the smell alone makes them gag before they can even put the meat in their mouths, and those who do manage to eat it describe flavors ranging from extremely fishy to chemical-like. The texture of properly prepared H. Carl is firm and somewhat chewy, with the outer portions that dried more thoroughly being tougher than the slightly softer interior. The meat is typically cut into small cubes and served as an appetizer or specialty dish, often accompanied by a shot of Brennivin Icelandic schnapps to help wash down the intense flavors. Modern Icelanders consider H. Carl a traditional delicacy that connects them to their Viking ancestors, though even many Icelanders admit they do not particularly enjoy eating it, and do so more out of cultural tradition than culinary preference. The fact that Vikings developed this extraordinarily complex and lengthy process to make poisonous shark meat edible demonstrates the level of food scarcity they faced and their unwillingness to waste any potential resource. They could not afford to let hundreds of kilograms of protein go unused, just because it required months of processing to make it safe. This same principle of waste, nothing use everything, drove all of Viking food preservation technology. Nothing that could potentially feed people was discarded if any method existed to preserve it. Rotten eggs could be fermented into edible products. Sour milk became way for preservation. Bone marrow was extracted and preserved in fat. Blood was made into sausages that could be dried or smoked. Internal organs were preserved through multiple methods, depending on which worked best for each organ type. Every part of every animal had a use and a preservation method suited to its particular properties. This comprehensive approach to food preservation is what allowed Vikings to survive and thrive in environments where other European cultures would have starved. They turned resource scarcity into technological innovation, developing methods that were in many ways more sophisticated than the salt-based preservation used by wealthier Southern European societies. So we have now explored all 6 major preservation methods that Vikings used, but how did they actually store all this preserved food once it was created, creating tons of stockfish and smoked meat and fermented products does no good if rats eat it or moisture ruins it or thieves steal it. Viking storage logistics had to be as sophisticated as their preservation techniques. The solution involved specialized structures and careful planning that protected food from all the threats that could destroy a winter's worth of provisions. The primary storage structure was called a stabber, which was essentially a small barn or warehouse raised high off the ground on wooden or stone pillars. This elevation served multiple critical functions that made the stabber one of the most important buildings in any Viking farmstead. First, raising the structure off the ground protected stored food from ground moisture that would cause rot, especially important in the damp Scandinavian climate, where ground-level storage would quickly become moldy. Second, the elevation protected against flooding from spring snowmelt or heavy rains that could inundate ground-level storage areas. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the pillars were designed specifically to prevent rodents from climbing up into the storage area, which was critical because rats and mice could devastate a winter food supply in a matter of weeks. The pillars supporting the stabber were made smooth and often had wide caps or metal bands at the top that created overhangs impossible for rodents to climb past, functioning like medieval rodent baffles. The stabber itself would have no windows or only tiny openings covered with metal screens to prevent birds and insects from entering. The door would be heavy and fit tightly when closed, often with a metal threshold that rats could not gnaw through. Inside, food would be organized carefully with different types of provisions stored in specific areas. Dry goods like stockfish and dried meat would be hung from the rafters or placed on slatted shelves that allowed air circulation to prevent any residual moisture from accumulating. Barrels of fermented foods weigh preserved meats, and salted items would be stacked in one section arranged so that the oldest barrels could be accessed first. Cheeses would have their own area, often on upper shelves, where the slightly warmer temperature near the roof would help them continue aging. The most valuable items like imported spices or honey would be stored in locked chests that only the head of household could access. Underground cellars were also important storage spaces for items that needed to stay very cold, such as the way-preserved barrels we discussed earlier. These cellars would be dug as deep as practical, often 2 to 3 meters down, where temperatures remain stable year-round near freezing, regardless of surface condition. The entrance would typically be through a trapdoor in the floor of the main house, making it secure from theft and protecting it from external temperature fluctuations. The walls of the cellar would be lined with stones or wood to prevent collapse, and in some cases additional insulation would be added using turf or straw to maintain stable low temperatures. For provisions being taken on sea voyages, storage had to be even more carefully planned because space was extremely limited on long ships and protection from seawater was critical. The dragon ships that Vikings used for raiding and exploration had very little dedicated cargo space because most of the interior was taken up by rowing benches for the crew. Provisions had to be stored under these benches in waterproof containers or hung from the ship's ribs in spaces too small for other uses. The Vikings were masters of the craft of barrel making, producing containers that were not only watertight but could withstand the constant movement and impacts of ocean voyages without splitting or leaking. These barrels would be packed with the most calorie-dense foods available, primarily stockfish, dried meat, hard cheese, and butter, all foods that could survive getting slightly damp without immediate spoilage. Liquids were stored in separate containers, usually ale or beer rather than water, because fermented beverages lasted longer without developing the foul taste and dangerous bacteria that could grow in stored water. Each warrior on a voyage would typically be allocated a personal ration stored in a small chest or sack that he was responsible for managing, with additional communal supplies stored centrally under the command of the ship's captain. The daily ration during a voyage was probably quite monotonous, consisting primarily of dried fish that could be eaten without preparation, hard flatbread made from rye or barley flour that would last for months, and perhaps some cheese if supplies were good. These items could be consumed cold without any cooking, which was important because lighting cooking fires on a wooden ship at sea was dangerous and often impossible in rough weather. When conditions allowed and the ship was in calm waters or had made landfall, hot meals would be prepared by boiling dried peas or beans with pieces of dried meat to make a thick stew, or by rehydrating stockfish and cooking it into a soup. But these hot meals were probably infrequent treats rather than daily occurrences on most voyages. The genius of the Viking preservation system becomes clear when you consider the full logistics chain from farm to ocean voyage. Every method we have discussed fit together into an integrated system where waste from one process became input for another. Way from cheese, making preserved meat. Bones from butchered animals became tools or were boiled for marrow fat. Even the entrails and organs that could not be preserved through standard methods were fed to dogs or used as fishing bait. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be afforded to waste in the harsh northern environment where Vikings lived. This efficiency, this refusal to let any potential resource go unused, was one of the keys to Viking success in expanding across the North Atlantic. When we look at the legacy of these preservation methods today, over 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended, what is striking is how many of these techniques are still in use and still producing foods that are considered delicacies rather than survival rations. Norwegian stockfish is still exported worldwide as a premium product, sold to Italian restaurants where it becomes bacalhau, and Portuguese homes where it becomes bacalhau, commanding prices that would have made Viking merchants wealthy beyond imagination. The traditional production methods have changed remarkably little because they work too perfectly to improve upon using only natural conditions without artificial refrigeration or chemical preservative. Carl is still produced in Iceland using almost exactly the same methods Vikings developed, and while it remains an acquired taste even for Icelanders, it is served as a cultural delicacy that connects modern Icelanders to their ancestors. Swedish Surster Emming fermented Baltic herring that is arguably even more pungent than H. Carl is a direct descendant of Viking fermentation techniques. Smoked salmon, produced in Scandinavia today using traditional cold smoking methods, is sold in fine food shops worldwide at premium prices. Skyr, the fermented milk product that provided whey for preservation, has become an international health food sensation, marketed as Icelandic yogurt with high protein content. Every single one of these modern products traces its origins directly back to the preservation methods Vikings developed out of necessity and perfected over centuries. The science we now understand behind these methods validates what Vikings learned through observation and experimentation. The antimicrobial properties of smoke, the preservation effects of lactic acid, the power of removing moisture to prevent bacterial growth, the utility of cold and anaerobic conditions, these were all principles Vikings understood intuitively and applied practically long before anyone could explain them. Microbiology and chemistry behind them. They were food scientists who worked without laboratories or microscopes, using only their senses and their willingness to experiment with methods that must have seemed bizarre even to them when first attempted. If you want to discover more revolutionary technologies from the Viking Age that challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval life, make sure you subscribe to this channel because next week we are revealing how Vikings navigated across thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses, using a navigation method so ingenious that modern scientists spent decades trying to figure out if the legends were actually possible. And leave a comment below telling us which of these preservation methods shocked you the most, because your engagement helps us understand what topics fascinate viewers and guides our research for future videos. Share this video with anyone who still believes Vikings were primitive barbarians, rather than sophisticated engineers who solved problems that would challenge modern technology.